wombat was an accident. I was literally jumped on by a publisher at the Adelaide Writers' Festival after I'd been writing other books. And she said, "Have you ever thought of writing a picture book?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Would you like to do it?" And so I wrote one. And some years after that, I wrote Diary of a Wombat. What I started off writing were, in fact, books for adults, stories for adults, detective stories for adults. I'd won a silver dagger, I think, for one of them. But suddenly, I had a career, I had an income. I was writing books I absolutely loved with the most fantastic team at HarperCollins. But this has always been the kind of books that I kept on writing, even though I was writing books for young people at the same time. And finally, a few years ago, they agreed that under the name of Jackie French, we could bring out the books I had been writing, in fact, since I was 6 years old. And like all of my books, Becoming Mrs Mulberry is a compilation of real things. When I was 7 years old, I had a dingo uncle. I was very ill when I was 7. I was ordered by the doctor to go to what was then a very isolated island off the coast of Queensland. There was a tiny motel. There was no bridge to the island. There were 2 kids who lived there. And they had already been adopted by the uncle. And I joined them. And he was always there. When I looked out the window, when I woke up every morning, there he was underneath a tree, just waiting. We never patted him. We never fed him. But he was always wherever we explored on the island. There he was, padding or panting under a tree. If adults came, he would stand up, his hackles would raise. He would make sure that we were okay, then he'd lie down again. Once we were on the beach, we were swimming, in fact, and he started to his feet and he started to howl, that incredible dingo, woo, howl. And we had no idea what was wrong. So we raced out of the beach towards him. And it was only then we saw the sharks coming in to shore. He'd been watching for us. He had saved us. That's just one incident in Becoming Mrs Mulberry. I might read the back of this because, to be honest, writing a blurb takes almost as long as it takes to write a book. You have no idea how many emails it takes to come up with the title of a book and the blurb of a book. So please excuse me if I just read the blurb. The once impoverished medical student, Agnes Glock, is now the fabulously wealthy Mrs Mulberry. Her estate in the mountains is magnificent, a haven of those too ravaged by the Great War to cope with a society that first condemned them to battle and now shuns them. The war has, however, stolen Agnes's chance to graduate as a doctor, as well as the fiancé she adored. Her husband, Douglas Mulberry, remained shell-shocked and unable to speak. Their scandalous marriage is a farce, an act of kindness to keep Douglas away from an insane asylum. It's set in 1924. The book opens with one of my favorite scenes. In fact, Agnes's haven, set, well, actually rather like a mountain that I've just been climbing up before I came into this podcast. In fact, look, let's be honest, it's exactly the same mountain, and Agnes's estate is exactly where I live. And the book is also based on something I believe very strongly. It's Hildegard of Bingen, who was a medieval doctor, an abbess, and many other things as well, including a poet. She believed in the force viridis, that is the power of green and growing things that surround people with woods, with a bush, with peace, that there is a force that will help them heal. And I believe that very firmly, and so did Agnes. And so It opens with a slightly unfortunate incident. Private Private was once a zoology professor. But when he cast off his uniform at the end of World War I, he cast off all clothes. He refuses to wear anything except possibly a blanket on very cold nights. He was not a private, but he now wants to be an ordinary man. His name is Private. And his wombat, unfortunately, has got a taste for chewing up silk knickers. So on the first page, we open with, yes, this dreadful catastrophe, according to the maid. The wretched wombat has chewed up all of Agnes's silk knickers. Ever since her marriage in 1920, she has bought nothing for herself. But even Agnes, on her mountain refuge and the estate, cannot go Nicholas. Sorry, that is Nicholas, not the name. She needs to rethink. She has a fortune. She's been spending this money on other people, setting up the clinic, setting up the refuge, supporting her husband through his shell shock, though he still is unable to speak. She goes to Sydney. She indulges in everything a wealthy woman can. And on the way home, quite accidentally, impulsively, she stops at a circus, which is the circus she knew as a child and which advertises the Dingo Girl. This malformed child who cannot speak, who dribbles, who has a moon face, who goes on all fours. The circus claims she was brought up by a dingo. Agnes, who nearly graduated as a doctor. His father was a doctor, his uncle was a doctor. She has a medical background. She recognizes what very few doctors in 1924 would see, that the child has a thyroid deficiency, and that possibly with weekly doses of a bovine thyroid extract, within a few weeks, this child might be cured. She rescues her. But there are so many attempts to actually bring the child back. So you never quite know where you are with this book. Can a child be brought up with dingoes? What is the crime that this child might possibly reveal if she was able to speak? Who is Agnes Mulberry? This woman who now is in contact with fiance she assumed was dead when she married Douglas, with a husband who, identifying with this child who also cannot speak, and again in The Peace of the Mountains is recovering. But it's also full of the most wonderful, glorious, eccentric characters like Bertha the trapeze artist who has rescued the Dingo Girl, etc., and the Dingo Man, and many, many others. It's a compilation of so much that is real. The extraordinary struggle of women back then to become doctors. Agnes is in Edinburgh because by then, 1913, when she enrolls, women in Australia were allowed to be medical students, but you couldn't be registered as a doctor without doing your residency in a hospital. And no hospitals would take women, except in Edinburgh, where women had actually set up a hospital for that reason. If in Edinburgh she can graduate, she can do her residency, and then she can practice anywhere in the whole of the British Empire. But those first women went through the most incredible battle. They were called whores in the press. For wanting to do something as so nominally as medicine. The male students pelted them with dog excrement and other excrement. With the first of the exams, the male medical students linked arms like this, and in a crowd would not let the women through to do the exams, till finally a sympathetic male medical student opened a window at the back and sort of did that to the women, and they stuck around and they got through the window and they did the exams. In fact, it was after that, I think the male medical students became actually rather ashamed of what they'd done. They started to escort the women to lectures, and then World War I came. The university, who charged women twice as much as men, actually needed the female students because most of the males had enlisted in World War I. So we have Agnes, who has been able to go through medicine, who has got an enormous amount of clinical experience, and who desperately, enormously, determinedly is going to be a doctor, despite the loss of the fiancé she has adored. But then there is Douglas. If the only way to secure Douglas from his uncle, who wants to put him in an insane asylum, is to marry him, so she will become his guardian. I learned about all of those. Again, my uncle did medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and as a child I got his letters and I just treasured his letters, particularly because he'd taken me to the Royal Easter Show, and instead of a doll on a stick I got a skeleton on a stick, and I was furious. I took it back enraged. It was not anatomically correct. It didn't have the right number of ribs. So yes, Laurie wrote to me, my grandfather, who was a psychiatrist who reformed Callan Park, where the mental patients were just strapped onto urine-soaked mattresses, strapped down, left in isolation, rats crawling over them. It was worse than anything you can imagine. But to save Douglas from that, the only thing she could possibly do was to marry him. Aha, we have got some questions. Okay. Veronica Joy, Agnes's humility and compassion had me in tears more than once. Well, actually, me too. Patrick White always said that he knew a book was working if he was crying, and I find the same thing. But look, not necessarily because it's sad. It's really easy to make people cry with a depressing ending. You finish a book and you think, oh dear, I feel so depressed. I feel like cutting my wrist. It must be a brilliant book to make me feel like this. It is so much harder to get people cry with joy or transcendence or just hilarity, as with Private and The Wombat and The Silk Knickers. So definitely tears. Yes, I know a book is working if there are tears of some kind in my life. Jane Tara, hi Jackie, love the book. Veronica Joy is such a great character. Private. Look, I love Private. And by the way, there is a lovely ending in the book for Private too. Jenny Elvins, absolutely loved Mrs Mulberry. Was lucky enough to receive an advance copy. Jane Tara, how long did it take? Sorry, I'm trying to work out how to get the comments, more comments and see them. How long did it take to write the novel? Good question. I'm not quite sure. To some extent, of course, I've been writing it all my life. I wrote my first novel when I was 6. I took it to the teacher, who showed it to the headmistress, who had a copy published for all the kids in the infant school. By the age of 13, I'd written a trilogy. I was infuriating by Lord of the Flies. So I wrote a trilogy about a group of Australian young people who are stranded by an aeroplane crash on an island in the Great Barrier Reef. And in the first book, they're going to survive. The second, they are setting up an ideal society, so unlike the Australia of the 1960s that I knew. In the third one, they've achieved it, but it seems only by the use of a lot of intrusive cameras, etc., to make sure that they do behave nicely to each other. And as a 13-year-old, of course, I had a wonderfully melodramatic ending. The heroine poisons the hero, who's in charge of the island, or ostensibly in charge of the island. He comes to dinner at her place. She gives him a poisoned food. And as he is eating his dinner, he explains to her that the cameras have not been working for 5 years, that human beings are intrinsically good, are intrinsically kind and compassionate, and only need a chance to behave that way. And so none of the regulations, none of the cameras, nothing has been working. he has not been in control. Everyone has been free. And of course, she realizes it was a mistake and he dies tragically, because that's the sort of thing that you write when you are 13. By the time you're my age, you make sure everyone except the villain has got a happy ending, because after all, it's the choice of every author. Where do you finish a book? And I think it's cheating to end at a place that is depressing. So certainly for Private, there is a lovely ending. Sue Griggan, well, fantastic. Oh, Jenny, stunning cover. Does it meet your expectations? Oh, look, it is just glorious. How do you portray a young woman of intelligence, determination, compassion, but who unexpectedly has found herself one of the richest women in Australia and is actually not quite sure how she should behave, or for that matter, even who she is by 1924. Who does she want to be? Now suddenly she has got so many choices in her life as her husband recovers. So no, the cover is gorgeous. I think you probably can't see even the gold lettering on the cover. It is beautiful. Oh, Jane Tara again. I love the sound of the book you wrote at 13. And I love that wombats appear in it and behind you now. Well, I have to admit, I do love wombats. I hope the wombats... No, actually, that's not true. I was going to say, I hope the wombats like me. That's not a truthful statement. Wombats would seem sometimes to be cupboard love. They only love you for your carrots. I was going to say they only love you for your carrots, but in fact that isn't true. With Mothball, who was the very real wombat in Diary of a Wombat, and the sequel, Diary of a Rescued Wombat, just once, look, it had been one of those just hassled, horrendous days, and she'd been nagging me for carrots, and I went out and I snapped at her. I spoke angrily. I said, oh, look, for Pete's sake, look, leave me alone. I will bring them in a minute. Just be patient. And she looked at me with absolute puzzlement. And then she just walked away. And she didn't come back again for about 3 weeks. She actually did understand that I was angry. I wasn't shouting at her. She understood from my gestures, my body language, possibly the odor of angry hormones. I don't know how she knew that one time I actually didn't want to see her. I regarded her as intrusion. I needed to get back to what I was doing. And I hurt her when I did that, and I didn't mean to do it. So no, I do know, in fact, that the wombats do like me. It is not just cupboard love. It is, in fact, one of the greatest privileges you can have, to have a friendship with a wild animal. And that, too, I think, is probably where Mrs Mulberry started. It wasn't the 3 months I spent writing it. It wasn't the 3 months we spent editing it. It wasn't the 3 months we spent trying to find the title. It was, I think, begun by the 7-year-old girl who had a dingo uncle. Because of that dingo uncle, I knew that it was possible to be an animal among other animals, that the bush was a friendly place, a healing place. I was actually quite ill when I went to the island. I was well when I came back again. I think because of that, the first wombat I had as a friend, and he was the one who made the friendship advances, not me, Smudge. I was living in a shed and having breakfast, sitting on the hill, and he would be grazing in the early morning light. And he was curious about me. He'd never come across a human before. And he decided I needed to learn about the bush. And for several years, I just spent the nights, moonlit nights mostly, so I could see. He would take me to springs. He took me up one wombat hole, up a hollowed a hollowed out gigantic tree struck by lightning, and the wombat had dug through the rotting inside of the tree. So there was a sit at the top, and the wombat and I could sit up there and look down the valley, or I could look down the valley in the moonlight. Wombats are short-sighted, but he was smelling the view and I was seeing it. So how long did the book take to write? Most of my life, probably. But in terms of actually typing, only about 3 months. I didn't sit down and think I am going to write a 140,000 word book, though. I would be terrified to do that. Instead, every morning when I go for a walk in the valley, which is coincidentally rather like the valley and the mountain in Mrs Mulberry, I think of the scene I'm going to write that day. Just one scene. I can write a scene. I can't write a book. I can write a scene. And slowly on my walk back, the ideas in my subconscious seep forward. I always know the book I'm going to write. I know who it is, what it's about. I always write the ending first. But that scene that I'm going to write that day, that comes in the morning. And I write that scene. It may not be the beginning. It can be a scene anywhere in the book that is vivid. And then after about 3 days or even 3 weeks, I suddenly realize I am writing a book, and the scenes come together. I start writing the beginning and the whole book actually. Well, look, by then I am so deep in the book, I really can't stop writing. I've just finished the book after becoming Mrs Mulberry. I finished it, in fact, at 1 a.m. on Sunday morning. I started revising it, I think, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday. And I was so caught up in the book, even though I wrote it. I know what happens in the end, but even then, I was caught up as a reader rather than a writer as I did that final revision, and I couldn't put the book down until 1 a.m. I hope with becoming Mrs Mulberry, and I hope with that one too, that you get as caught up in the world as I do. For me, a book is something of extraordinary power. It is an escape that you can carry in your handbag. You need never be bored when you have got a book with you. My childhood was probably, well, about 50% terror, about 40% boredom, and the rest was books. Books were how I escaped mentally and physically. But now there's, look, when I'm happy, I write. When I'm hassled, I write. When I'm scared, I write. When I'm frightened, I write. After major surgery, I couldn't sleep. So I wrote a musical about the Sisters of St. Joseph and Mary MacKillop. But I don't think Australia is quite ready for a musical about St. Mary of the Cross yet. Possibly one day, though. In retrospect, it actually was rather good. Any other questions? Malvina York. I also thought the title was very thoughtful and completely suited the book. It's not my title. It's Lisa Berryman's from HarperCollins HA, who published the book. The working title was The Dingo Girl, and my first concept of it was far more about the child. But as I wrote the book, of course, it became about Agnes, very, very much about Agnes. And Lisa read the book and rang me immediately and said she adored it. But she said, look, it's not The Dingo Girl. It's becoming Mrs Mulberry. It's about Agnes Glock and how she becomes Mrs Mulberry and finds who she is as Mrs Mulberry. And she was absolutely right. It's the perfect title. When can we expect another book, Jackie? It's from Jenny Elvins. Do you have one in the pipeline? I have always books in the pipeline. The book I finished at 1 a.m. on Sunday morning is now with Lisa, who has not yet read it. And so, of course, I'm absolutely terrified because with every book, I think it's not going to work. It's not going to work. I will never write a book again. So I still haven't had Lisa's response. So hopefully that will be coming out next year. I've also got a book that's for 12 years and up, coming out next month, The Great Gallipoli Escape. It's a book about the evacuation of Gallipoli, and no one has written about it. In histories of the evacuation, there are at the most 1 or 2 pages, and that's because it was secret. A group of Australians, including General Burwood, including some corporals, the men, absolutely trusted men, knew the British were going to give the orders to evacuate, and they came up with a plan, knowing they'd only have a few days to do it. And the RSL recorded the oral histories, the men who were there, talking as old men about that evacuation. And so I spent months listening to these old men talk about those days, and it's extraordinary. The cricket match that the Australians played with the Turks, that's never been recorded. The man who refused to leave Gallipoli. He'd enlisted with his mates. He was not leaving. They promised they would stick together. They were one of the last parties to go down to the cove. There were supposed to be 9 men. There were 8. And there was a voice in the darkness say, I won't actually say the word on camera, but you can think what it is. And they look, so give us 10 minutes, we'll be back. And they raced off into the darkness up to the Australian trenches on the heights. And there he was, sitting like that. He was not leaving his mates. So they picked him up by the elbows and by the feet, and they carried him like that. And according to the blokes talking about it, they said they just shoved him on the first barge they came to and legged it for their own ship. And he made it through the war, and so did they. But it's not recorded. The man who would not evacuate. It's not really a war book, because by then they weren't fighting. It is a book of humour, of endurance. It is the most extraordinary story of adventure and heroism. And even though it is for young people, I think adults are going to find it extraordinary, because this is the story of the Gallipoli we need to know. This is the real Gallipoli. These are the real heroes of Gallipoli, not the cliches. This is the reality told by the men who were there, as my father-in-law was. And if you're trying to do the sums, he was quite elderly when he married and had children. Oh, Sue Gregan, you're an absolute breath of fresh air. So pleased I tuned you live. I'm so glad that you did too. It is such a privilege to be able to talk to you. It is such a privilege to be able to write books like this. When I was a kid, I was told that if you wish on the first star you see at night, you'll get your heart's desire. I don't know where I got the idea, but every night I would sit out on the grass in the backyard and I'd wait for the first star and I'd wish on it. And I wished that I could be an author and write books like this, great, big, fat books that people could get lost in, people that would find the magic that I had found in books. And I wished every night, year after year after year, and now I've got it. Everything that I wished for as a child, apart from 100 dogs. I wanted 100 dogs back then, but now I've got wombats, wallabies, and various other wildlife as well. I think I'm probably better off without that. But I've got the house in the bush, I've got the trees, I've got the good conversation of an evening, I've got the beauty of the bush around me. I've got wombat friends, not dingo friends, though interestingly, just a few months ago, we heard dingoes howl again in the valley. When I first came here nearly 50 years ago, the dingoes called every night. And in this extraordinary miracle of coincidence, the day I sent this, called The Dingo Girl, off to Lisa, the dingoes howled again. The dingoes sang again at night. I haven't heard them for a few weeks, but I think I probably will again when they're mating. The dingoes have come back again. So as I said, it is an incredible privilege to be with you tonight, and it is every dream I have ever had. So look, please buy this book, so I can keep writing more books. Please tell everyone you know, please buy this, so that I can keep staying up till 1 a.m. absolutely engrossed in the book and the world I am creating, and in the world that I want to escape to, and I hope you enjoy escaping into it as well. A world that is reality times 10, without all of the boring bits, and with Agnes Mum's duck scones, which, by the way, are absolutely delicious, and just possibly not silk knickers, because, in fact, they're not very practical, particularly if you've got a wombat with a fancy for them. But no, it is a complete, absolute privilege to write the books, to be able to spend day after day after day creating the worlds I want to plunge into, putting them on the page, and knowing that people will read them and hopefully respond to them in the way that I have. And so far that's worked. But every author, I think, will probably tell you that every time they write a book, they feel like hiding under their desk until it's published and they get a response. And I'm still feeling like that about Mrs Mulberry. It only came out today. And yes, to be honest, a small part of me would like to actually hide under the desk till the reviews come out, till I get the readers' comments. But the comments from the early readers who got the early comments have all just been magnificent. They've just been wonderful. So I think, thank goodness, I think it works. I think it really actually does work. Private, tune-up knickers, stroppy medical students, the magic of the mountain, and the dingoes and the circus and the wonderful woman on the trapeze. I think it works. Thank you.